chase perfection. So now on to the afternoon. We've got an outstanding speaker for our afternoon keynote. We're absolutely delighted to have him. So our speaker for this afternoon is Richard Gerver. Richard is a former primary school head teacher turned international speaker and keynote. He's the author of a number of books, including Education: A Manifesto for Change, Creating Tomorrow's Schools Today, and Simple Thinking. So just let me find his video and I'll get that played just now. So without further ado, let's listen to Richard.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm so sorry that because of all kinds of events, we can't be together in person. But I want to start this afternoon by just saying thank you and paying tribute to you all. Thank you, first of all, for giving up your Saturday to be here with us, to be learning and committing to learning to be better for our students. But perhaps more importantly than that, I just want to say a heartfelt thank you for everything you have done over the last 2 years. Although I'm a former teacher and former head, my wife is still a head teacher, my daughter's a teacher. And so I have been watching them in sheer amazement deal with the last 2 years and still have the energy to be so deeply and professionally committed to the future of our children. I have been inspired by the actions and talent of my profession. So thank you all so much. Look, this afternoon, we've only got a short time together. You're probably relieved at the thought that you can move on to the proper learning after you've had Grandad here post-lunch. But I just wanted to share a few thoughts, really, about, first of all, a post-COVID future, and also a little bit about how that can be informed by the lived experience of COVID over the last couple of years. So let's get started. And I hope you find this of use and interest, and at least something meaningful to drink your post-lunch coffee and hopefully eating a bit of very, very naughty cake with. So let's start right back at the beginning. Let's start at the beginning of this horrific period in our lived human history. And I don't know about you, but over the last 2 years, I've gone through a whole variety of emotional states. I remember when COVID first hit us, I was in a state of mental paralysis. I remember coming back from a work trip. I remember putting on the TV news, reading the internet. And although I was trying to absorb what was happening, the information, what we were hearing, what we were learning, most of it just bounced off. You know, in that way that sometimes you can be reading a book and you're absorbed in that book for 20 minutes, half an hour. And then suddenly it strikes you that although you were actually reading the words, nothing was going in. Well, that was pretty much a state I experienced at the very start of this horrific, horrific time. And then I kind of moved into a period of denial, as I think many people may have done, certainly early March 2020. You know, the whole trope about, oh, it's a flu, or it's not going to be as serious as they say, or they're overreacting, or it'll all be over by Easter, or at the very latest, the summer of 2020. That kind of denial didn't obviously work, and it didn't make me feel any better. And when that didn't stem the tide, particularly of my emotional panic and response to what was happening, I went through a period of anger. I was angry at everybody I could possibly be angry at, even my neighbors. For the first time in my life, I became a curtain twitcher. I was writing down the movements of who was going and who was coming and who was having people over. And then, much to my wife's unbelievable annoyance, she is genuinely a saint. Because having spent all day doing a proper job in school, she would come home and I would confront her like the local neighborhood watch with my notepad, talking about all these people and all their transgressions. How she didn't slap me, I do not know. But the anger didn't help. And finally, in these cycles of emotions that I felt in waves over the last 18 months, and I think the most common feeling for me has been to slip into periods of, I suppose, mild despair, sometimes not so mild. You know, that emotional feeling of a lack of hope, a lack of anything to cling on to look forward to, a lack of belief, a profound sense, I think, of disenfranchisement, of a lack of control. That moment where you just feel totally like a victim. And I'm sure I'm not the only one, and it won't be the last time. But I think these 4 phases are not just lived experiences from COVID, but actually the human response to change, and particularly when change is done to us, when we feel that we have no control. And I think to an extent, it's felt very much like that for educators for a very long time, where we keep being bombarded with stuff, new policies, new systems, new thinking, new science, new approaches, new things we need to juggle. And I know that David talked with such eloquence and such trademark humor about this morning. And I just want to reflect that now. Because one of the things we need to resist is to be drowned under stuff because we're desperately trying to cling to find levers to give ourselves control. Now, yeah, the way out of this feeling of helplessness, of victimhood, when it comes to change, evolution, transformation, is to try and fire our curiosity. Because if you can have the strength and courage to lift your heads above the parapet and look around and ask questions and fire that curiosity, then emotionally you start to feel a level of control. You start to feel there is a chance and opportunity. And it allows you to feel like you've become an active participant again. Now, I think on so many levels, this little narrative has or should have a profound impact on the way we think about the future of education, and actually about how we prepare all of us for that future. We have to come to terms with the fact that the worlds of certainty that we think existed in the past really didn't. And certainly as we accelerate headlong into a more complicated future, one that will be dominated by environmental issues, technological issues, health issues, economic issues, socio-ethnic issues, we have to understand that we need to become so much more fleet-footed. We need to be so much better at coping with radical and dramatic change. We need to find ways of holding on to levers of control at the points when we feel that that control is slipping away profoundly from us. And so what I want to do this afternoon is just spend a few minutes taking a step back, reflecting, thinking a little bit about what I've just said and how that can help us shape and frame the future for us, for our schools, for our communities, and most importantly, for our children. But I do have a fear, and it's one I know that David spoke so much at length about this morning. And it is this over-complexity. I don't think it's new. I think it's been around certainly since I started teaching in 1992. This constant search for the answer, for the correct way to do everything. And I think that has been amplified over the last few years with this kind of reimagining of what education needs to be about. You know, the terms like research-based and cognitive science and all of these things, which are all, it's great, right? It's all about professionalism. It's all about development. But for 30 or 40 years, we've been bombarded with silver bullets. We've been bombarded with the answer from generations of people that tell us it's been deeply researched and evidence-based, and this is the way it is. I mean, just let's take cog-sci for a minute, right? It's great. It has a profound impact on how we understand human beings learn, and therefore, by process, it helps us understand a little bit about how we might plan our future of learning. But let's remember that cognitive development is only about 1/10 of the way human beings learn and evolve. So the danger is to always embrace one silver bullet. But on a more human level, what that's done in so many ways is just underline to us in complex times this idea that somehow learning has to be complicated. Now, don't get me wrong. Education is not easy. Great teaching is tough. It's hard. But it doesn't necessarily have to be complicated. A few years ago, I was working in Seattle and I had a day off, and I decided, like a lot of tourists in Seattle, that as part of my day off, I was going to visit the world's first Starbucks, this place here. It's the only Starbucks in the world that's allowed to use the gloriously politically incorrect original logo. Anyway, it turns out that every other tourist had a day off the day I did. And so the queue outside the world's first Starbucks went back for well over a mile. Now, I was quite excited. I was quite excited to get to the front of the queue, to be able to take a selfie so that I could show my daughter, who at the time was in her late teens, how cool her dad was by getting a coffee from the world's first Starbucks. And I was fine until I got to the point at which I took this photograph. Because at this point, I could hear what was going on inside the coffee shop. Now, what was happening inside the coffee shop was terrifying. You see, you've probably already guessed, by the way, I am an incredibly simple man. And the way I take my coffee pretty much sums that up, because I drink my coffee black in a cup about this big. No sugar, no milk, no syrups, nothing, just black coffee that big. And that's when I go into a coffee shop, what I order. Can I have a cup of black coffee, please, in a cup about that big? And they always give me a name for it. Oh, you mean a long black or a flat black or an Americano or a double espresso something? I go, yeah, that in a cup that big, please. And that's what I was going to do here. But by the time I got to this point, I could hear what was happening inside the shop. I could hear the orders. I could hear the excitement, because what was happening, these orders weren't like, can I have a cup of coffee, please? It was like urban poetry. It was like rap. These people were wanting 15 to 20 things done to their cup of coffee. I want a mocha, choca, latte, foam, no foam, hold the this, have the that, do the syrup. I want sprinkles. I want everything. And then the end of their order would be punctuated with something I still to this day don't understand, which was, and make it extra hot. It's a cup of coffee. Isn't it hot anyway? Anyway, at the end of the orders and these rambling, incredible terms, people were whooping. When we were in America, right? They were whooping. Great order. What a cup of coffee. Yo! You can hear the baristas clapping the orders. And I was thinking, in a minute, I'm going to go in there. I'm going to ask for a cup of black coffee and a cup this big, please. I could feel the disappointment. So I did the only thing available to me. I ran away. And as I ran away, I really reflected on this point about, when did we make everything so complicated? And at what point did we decide things could only be of value if they were complicated? And to an extent, I think that's been true about education for a very, very long time. And I think it's been amplified over the last 2 years, totally understandably. But our job now, I think, is to take a step back, reflect, and just reevaluate our vision and purpose. What is it we are actually here for? Is it to deliver a system more efficiently? Or is it actually to prepare our children for the challenges of their future? So let me share with you a couple of thoughts from people I've been privileged enough to meet over the last couple of years that have stimulated my thinking. And they're people from outside the school sector. Because I think sometimes in that ability to be curious, we need to lift our heads high enough above the parapet, not to constantly talk to the same people who all have the same kind of point of reference. If we're truly to be creative, if we're truly to be curious, we need to look higher and further. So the first of these remarkable people is this lady. She is a true genius. This is Minouche Shafik. Now, Minouche Shafik is currently the director of the London School of Economics. She has been the deputy governor of the Bank of England, and there are many, many people who feel she will be the first woman to break one of the last great glass ceilings in England, and that is to become the first female governor of the Bank of England. Now, a couple of years ago, I was lucky enough to hear her speak in Davos at the World Economic Forum, and it was a conversation that she was having about the future of education. And it struck me really powerfully because what she was saying is not necessarily new to us. And certainly to somebody like me, who is often accused of being some kind of left-wing kooky liberal around education, which, by the way, I firmly deny. I don't see that I have ever been political about education. I have always been entirely focused on children. That's not to say I'm always right or that I'm infallible. But I certainly have tried very hard to focus objectively on the future and our kids. But anyway, enough about me. This is about Minouche. So Minouche is this globally recognized hardcore economist. And I want to share with you two things that she said about education. The first is this, and I'll leave you to read that for yourself, but it's certainly not a new trope. This idea that routine cognition is the answer just is simply not the case. You know, she talks in detail about the need for soft skills, creative skills, research skills, the ability, yes, to find information, not to retain it or to have it, to find it and to synthesize it and then make something of it. Creativity, curiosity. But I tell you what, the more interesting thing she said, and I think it's incredibly relevant, both after the events of COVID, but before that, the fragmentation and polarization we've been witnessing around the world from a whole variety of polarizing political and socio events. And it's this, that it's no accident that the people who voted for populist parties around the world are people with, by and large, low levels of education. And here's the thing, it's not because they're stupid, it's because they're smart. Right? And this, for me, is one of the great challenges about the future of education. Because we seem to have been, more than ever, certainly over the last decade or so, on a relentless march to make education just more efficient. To do what we've always done, but more efficiently. And actually, over the last 2 years, what we've realized, because of all kinds of debacles within the system, is that that cannot be the answer. And that actually we need to take a serious review and look at what the future of education holds. Because if we don't, we're going to continue to prepare young people for worlds that don't exist. We are going to continue to make them promises about certainty if they get their heads down and do what they're told and do what they're asked, that the end of it will somehow lead magically to a safe and secure life. And that, by the way, is why there has been such a rise in anger and polarization, because good, hardworking, working class people have been doing what they've been asked. And suddenly, for all kinds of reasons, economic, environmental, social, health, have found themselves out of work, out of jobs, with no pension, with no hope for the future. And they've become angry, and they've become angry at the institution that they see has driven that. And so we have to be better at preparing young people for a different kind of future if we're to help them thrive in that very different and challenging world. So here's a thought. Let's just take a look for a minute at the work of the OECD. You know, those people we hate because they produce the PISA league tables that our press and politicians use to batter us with about how rubbish we are at education. The tragedy really is that they very, very rarely look at the research itself. And in 2013, the OECD produced a really interesting document called the Skills Outlook. They actually now have published several since, but the first one was 2013. And it was the first global research into the links between education, employability, and skills. And I want to share with you some of the key headlines from that report. By the way, I think you can still download it from the internet. It's worth reading. Some of the key headlines from that report. First of all, and this is really pertinent, I think, that the countries that continue to have an over-reliance on formal qualifications rather than the development of actual skills are the countries where young people will find it increasingly difficult to get work. Of course, can't blame schools and teachers for that, because that's the pressure we're under, this formal qualification acquisition environment. And of course, what that means is we increasingly, as children go higher up the system, focus intensely on preparing them to get the qualifications they need, rather than sometimes remembering that actually the development of those young people needs to be much wider and much grander. The second one, which again I think is incredibly relevant given the current climate and trend over the last couple of years, the research stated very, very clearly that whereas 40 or 50 years ago, routine cognition was by far the most important characteristic that organizations were looking for in their future workforce, now it was a tiny percentage. And actually the most important things for organizations outside of education were the development of interpersonal skills. That's just a thought for us all. And to that end, that yet again, this report underlined that the most important characteristics young people could show in the future was the ability to learn, adapt, and change constantly throughout their lives. And it's for another day. But one of the things I think we need to change in a much bigger picture is this idea that somehow formal education is finite and that it finishes at 18 or 21. And that actually education and access to education is there throughout our lives, from zero to grave. But we'll see. And then the final one, which again I think is incredibly important and something I've been privileged enough to step across over the last 15 years since I left frontline education, is we have to develop closer links between the worlds of work and of education. We have to understand that we are dealing in one singular narrative, life journeys, life chances, life choices. And that we can't just have fragmented systems that work almost independently of each other. We have to find a new relationship and way forward. A couple more thoughts for you, and then I promise I'm going to let you get on with the good stuff. The next is another meeting I had with another spectacularly brilliant human being. For those of you that don't recognize him, and yes, some people have said that he looks a little bit like my grandfather, and I wish. This is Barry Barish. Now, Barry Barish was the 2017 Nobel Prize winner for physics, a man that they reckon is up there with Stephen Hawking as one of the greatest minds of the modern era. And for those of you that are scientists that want to know, Barry won his Nobel Prize for his work into gravitational waves. Now, I say that earnestly to the camera like I know what that is. I really don't. And I do apologize, because to me, gravitational waves sounds like a hair care product. But there you go. I got the chance to ask him about how he put his team together, the team that went on to win a Nobel Prize. And what he said really interested me, because both of the characteristics he was looking for really didn't have a lot to do with science itself. He said, Richard, we had over 3,500 serious applicants. And I asked him to qualify what he meant by serious applicants. He said, oh, these were people that had at least 2 doctorates to their name and were some of the most renowned scientists in the world, having had their abstracts published in some of the most important journals. I said, and how many places did you have funding for on your research project? He said, well, we were incredibly well funded. We were based out of Caltech, and they had enough funding for us for 138 people. I said, wow, how did you get from 3,500 to 138? He said, well, I'll tell you, there were 2 caveats. He said, the first was this: when you're dealing with transformation, evolution, creativity, he said, which is actually, of course, the essence of great science, you can't have single track, single-minded, blinkered people. He said, the problem is in our society that when people become good at something, and particularly in science, we become more and more narrow in our focus. And not just that, he said, that has a tendency to make us more and more narrow in the kind of people we hang out with and the kind of professional conversations we have. And so what happens is when we're trying to break paradigms, what actually happens is we end up recycling the same ideas. We breathe the same air all the time. He said, and when you're looking to challenge the beauty of the proof, isn't that a wonderful expression? When you're looking to challenge the beauty of the proof, he said, you need 3-dimensional people. And in order to have 3-dimensional people, you need people with a breadth of lived experience. He said, so nobody made it onto my team if all they had on their CVs was science. He said, in order to make it onto my team, you needed to have humanities, the arts, you needed really interesting hobbies. Because in order to think differently, in order to question and challenge, you have to have the courage to step outside of your own zone. You have to furnish your life with different experiences. And again, I think that's hugely relevant moving forwards, that if we're going to prepare our young people for the challenges of having to think differently, behave differently, be different, then we need to make sure we're not funneling them down one singular route towards efficiency. But the second thing he said was something I found intensely profound. Because he said this, he said, nobody made it onto my team if they didn't have the ability to ask stupid questions. Isn't that brilliant? We could spend a whole day debating that one. Is there such a thing? What on earth does it mean? But we know what he kind of is getting at, right? Which is this thing about whenever we're in rooms of people, why don't we? Why do we become more frightened of doing it? Young kids aren't, are they? But why? But why? But why? But why? But as we get older, we sit there and think, I'm just going to, just in case. So how do we create an education system which actually at its heart is about encouraging young people to ask stupid questions throughout their lifetime? And I'm going to finish with one more name drop, if I may. And it's an ultimate name drop. And it's one that, frankly, no matter what session I'm doing, everybody has to hear. It's almost contractual. Because just before this horrific period of our human history began, I got to meet one of the top 2 people on my fantasy dinner party list. You know, I'm sure you've all got them. You know, those lists of, oh, if only I could meet X, Y, and Z and have them around the table at one time. Some are living, some are dead. Well, I got to meet the number 2 on my list. The number 1, funnily enough, was this person's wife. And I'm still hoping one day I get the chance. But a while back, I got the opportunity to spend time with him. A couple of things just to say about this picture, as you gasp in extraordinary delight. The first thing is, look how pleased he is to see me. Clearly, and who knew, I was on his fantasy dinner party list too. I wish. The second thing to say is it isn't a waxwork, it really was Obama. And the third thing is to say, isn't it miraculous how many chins a beard can hide? But I want to finish by telling you about the very short conversation I was able to have with him. I got to ask him one question. And the question I asked him was this: what do you think you learned more than anything else during your time in the White House? And he flashed that smile. And by the way, you know how people say never meet your heroes, they'll disappoint you? He didn't. He was everything and more I could have ever dreamt he would be. He flashed that smile. He said, I'll tell you. He said, when I first arrived in the White House, Richard, I was able to surround myself with some of the greatest technical minds on earth, the greatest scientists, economists, greatest political strategists, thinkers. He said, but when I look back on my 8 years on the White House and I think about the problems that crossed my desk, the problems that crossed his desk, so what I realize is this: that when you strip them back, virtually none of those problems were actually technical by nature. He said they were largely human. They were about love, anger, jealousy, greed, hatred, tribalism, fear. He said, naturally, on reflection, the problem is this: when we encounter a challenge, our first reflex, possibly because of the way we were educated, is to find the technical solution before truly defining the human challenge. And as we finish this afternoon, that's what I want to ask you all to reflect on as you come towards the end of today and you move forward into the next challenge and complexity of our jobs. Please, 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 don't be seduced by the silver bullets or the technical. And remember that, like most things, and maybe more so, education at its heart has always been and will always be about the development of human beings. And that must be where our primary focus lies. Thank you all so much for your time and attention this afternoon. I hope it's not too long before we get to meet in person. Thank you again for everything. Go forward, be strong, and just be as wonderful as you have been over the last 2 years. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you very much.
Fiona, what a start to the afternoon.
Great to kick off with, Richard. So many interesting points that he made there, and linking really nicely with David Cameron's chat from this morning. I really liked what he was talking about, not having the same thinkers in teams and in leadership, having people that are willing to challenge and to do, again, what's right. I really, really like that, not just kind of sticking to yes, people that will just go along and kind of narrow that funneled vision of what we need for young people. Somebody made a really good comment about everything should be focused on the children and the young people, which I think, yeah, absolutely. If we're doing that, then we must be doing something right. Anything that you picked up on that? I also loved his coffee analogy as well, which again I think strikes very resonantly with lots of us in education and trying all these different combinations, and we maybe need to strip it right back and stick to our core strengths of what really works in the classroom for our young people.
No, certainly just the idea of human relationships, everything, and all about relationships and connections, which is definitely happening throughout today, such inspiring speakers and so on. So thank you very much for Richard for giving us our afternoon keynote. Sadly, he couldn't be with us today, but such a great talk, and hopefully sets us off and sets the tone for the rest of the afternoon. So